welcome. It is book club day at Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. Who loves a good book club?
Book clubs. That's how we met. Yeah,
I
we met
know,
through
I
book club.
know. Amanda and I are book club friends. Although I feel we haven't shared the story yet, Amanda. My youngest child requires that I refer to Amanda as a loose acquaintance because she recommended a nature documentary on Netflix, and I have a neurodivergent 12-year-old who's an empath, and I went through, does it have this? Does it have that? Does it have this? Because nature documentaries are usually a no-go with him. And Amanda said, no. She gave me a heads up. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. That's like the worst of it. Okay. I watched the first episode just to triple check, make sure things were good. All good. It was Penguin Town on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend it. I am going to give a spoiler though, real quick. It's really good. But they give all the penguin couples names during the nesting season, and there's Mr. and Mrs. Bougainvillea who live under a bougainvillea bush. And when Amanda was giving me the worst of the worst digest so that I could prepare my child and determine if it was a good fit, what happened, Amanda? Tell me what happened.
Well, I may have left out the demise of Mrs. Bougainvillea. I knew that Mr. Bougainvillea was a great dad. I just forgot why he had to really step up and be such a great dad.
Yeah. And she didn't come back from her hunting session for the day when she went out to go get sardines for her chicks. And I kept thinking, oh, she's going to come back. She's just delayed, because Amanda didn't tell me that she wouldn't come back. Next day, still not back, still not back. I'm like, things are not looking good here. So finally I Googled it because I was like, oh, this is going south real fast. So sure enough, yeah, but she doesn't come back. Spoiler alert. So yeah, my 12-year-old to this day is like, whenever he sees Amanda's picture on the screen or something when we're doing podcast work, he goes, oh, Amanda. It's totally a joke. It's totally a joke, but he's never going to let her live it down. So... But yeah, so
That's
Amanda
fine.
and I are loose acquaintances from book club. We met in a Homeschool Moms book club, and we've never read this book before, which is our first book club selection. We are reading Teach Your Own. What do you think, Amanda, is the power of a book club?
I like book club. First off, it holds me accountable to actually read whatever book I thought I wanted to read, but is actually just sitting on my shelf. But second off, for me, it's just like with reading anything else. I think it's so easy to miss things or to not think of, oh, yeah, that could apply this way, or I didn't actually think of that. And in book club, you get to hear everyone else's perspectives as well as just read the book. And so I just feel like you get so much more out of it.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. So if somebody's listening to this episode now, we're 3.5 minutes in, and they're thinking, I'm never going to read this book. I'm just going to skip to the next episode. Should they skip to the next episode?
I mean, look, if you don't have the time and you want to skip to the next episode, I'm not going to judge. But this is a great opportunity for you to hear kind of like the Cliff Notes version, the highlights of this book that's pretty well known. And, maybe you'll decide you want to know more about it, or maybe you'll just be able to be like, oh yeah, I know that John Holt book. Let me tell you about some of the things and you never had to actually read it, and you just actually sound like you did. This is your opportunity.
We'll never tell. We've got you covered.
Yep.
So on our social media channels, you can find the chapter breakdown. If you do decide you want to read along with us, you absolutely can. In today's session, we're going to be discussing the introduction materials and chapters 1 to 3. If you want to read along, you can. It's pinned on our stories on Instagram, and it's on Facebook. It's pinned on Facebook. So you could always find whatever the current book is and the chapter breakdown there if you want to read along. But otherwise, just come and listen to us chat about books for a few minutes and give you the high level overviews and the aha moments, and then you can go on with your life.
Yes, absolutely.
Not bad. So before we jump into introduction and chapters 1 through 3 for today, I would love to just say this book, Teach Your Own, was originally written by John Holt, who many consider to be one of the pioneers of homeschool education, discussion, etc. John Holt has since passed away. It was written originally in 1981. It has been revised by Pat Farenga, who's another kind of founder in the homeschool world. And so some parts are current, and you'll notice There's discussion about the pandemic and quarantine and things like that in there. So those are the Pat Farenga parts. And then some parts are direct quotes from the original book written by John Holt in 1981. As a result, we have grown a little bit as a society since 1981, and there are certain words that we don't use anymore, and so you will find some outdated language. It's not a ton. It's not all over the book where you're nauseous by the time you're done reading it. There's just one or two words here. For example, I came across one passage that referred to a little person in a way that we would not refer to a little person in 2024, or that we shouldn't be anyway. But in 1981, that language was different and not as universal. So just be prepared for that as you enter into the book. We are translating it into a more polite text when we come across those in our own minds when we're reading.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, part of the trouble of reading an outdated book or an old book.
Right.
It happens. Go ahead.
Okay,
Were
so
you going to say something? I felt the deep breath. Go for it.
Yeah. I'm going to just dive in. We did not say that we were going to read the foreword as part of book club, but I read the foreword because I started there and didn't fully realize that it wasn't the introduction. So in any event, there was there's kind of a common theme throughout the foreword. They talk a lot about learning loss. And as you referenced, they're drawing some parallels, and they mention the pandemic, and they're talking a lot about the pandemic and homeschooling and all of these kinds of things. And the foreword specifically talks about learning loss and the pandemic learning loss, and saying that they're the same, and that actually one argument is that learning loss isn't a thing, I completely disagree with that, and the research is pretty strong there. There is such a thing as learning loss. It is a real thing. The summer slide is real. But also then it goes on to say, and but if there is learning loss, it's the same as what we saw in the pandemic, and it's in poor communities. And that's also not accurate. It was during the pandemic, but learning loss, it varies in the real world, and it's not just in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. It's not that black and white. There is more learning loss in math, and specifically math computation, right? It's pretty easy to understand why kids would forget to do certain math things when they haven't had to do it for 3 months. And their, problem solving skills and critical thinking have improved over that time because they're older and their brains have matured more, and they were also doing more critical thinking and problem solving over the summer. So these things, that little bit in the forward really got to me, because I'm like, I really disagree with this, and I don't understand why. Now, when I went and did my own research to make sure that, like, okay, the research actually really supports where I'm coming from on this, right? There's not a ton of research. And while I think the research does not support the conclusion that he came to, and there are quite a few academics online who would agree with me, if I'm going to be generous, I could see how he might make that leap to those conclusions. But I will upfront, I will say I disagreed. And the foreword was very much not my favorite part of what I read.
And that's part of the beautiful thing about book club. You don't have to agree with everything that's in the book. So,
Absolutely.
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely. I have a few things that I wrote down too, where I was like, about that. Yeah. So, all right. So that's your kickoff from the forward. My kickoff thought about the book, or at least this first section of reading in the book, is there's a lot of talk about control in this section. Did you find that to be the case?
Yeah. There's a good amount of talk about control and parenting styles and parenting techniques and the way schools control kids. So yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. I noted a couple of sections there on 13. Page 13, sorry. Studies continue to show that having control over one's learning makes it easier to retain and use what was learned. On page 20, there's a section, this is a big one to let go of, controlling your children's time and thoughts. And it's interesting because I see a lot of that when I'm in Facebook groups and things like that, is this need to control kids' time, kids' energy, the way they learn, the the materials that they're using to learn, things like that. Not to say you shouldn't have any input into your kids' time or materials, but I think having input and having a discussion is very different than having control. And so that seemed to be kind of a recurring theme for me in reading the book, is that we want to be able to micromanage basically every aspect of education.
Mhm.
And not only is that not super practical, but it's probably also not the best for our kids as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of those things that if you actually take a step back and think about it, it's a no-brainer. You're like, well, I mean, duh, obviously. Uh, um, but it's also one of those things that someone kind of has to say a lot of times for you to have that light bulb moment of like, oh, yeah, my kid would probably remember more of that if I was like, hey, how do you want to learn about this? Do you want to watch a documentary? You want to watch a book? Do you want to take a field trip? And if they pick one, they're going to be more excited about it. They're going to pay more attention to it. And it didn't actually take that much longer to have that conversation.
No. Well, then it was like we talked about in the last episode too, where you were saying sometimes it takes you a little bit more to piece together materials that are going to work for your kiddo. And my thought was, if you're not taking the time to piece together things that are going to work for him, you're going to use the same amount of time, if not more, and be more frustrated swimming
Mhm.
upstream, fighting him to do something that doesn't work for him. So even if it takes you a little bit of extra time to involve your kids and listen to their opinions and things like that, when it comes to the choices that you're making for their education with them, when the rest of it is smoother sailing because they're on board and they're bought in and they feel heard and they feel appreciated, it's a completely different ballgame. Um,
Mhm.
I mentioned in our last episode that I used to work in corporate training for a huge pharmaceutical company, and I used to go to these training seminars, trainings for trainers, which is kind of funny. And they would talk about the principles of adult education, and one of them that they felt was super duper novel was that adults need to know the bigger picture of where their work fits in and why it's important. And they thought that was unique to adults, and so that people we should know that if we were going to be working with adults. And I'm like, what kids have you met that don't also feel the same way, right? And why do kids not deserve that? Why is that reserved for adults? It
Yeah.
was the strangest thing to me. When I look back, I can see the conference room that I was sitting in when somebody said that to me. And I just was like, where did you get that from? That kids don't also want to be heard and know how things fit into the big picture and have a bigger understanding. I was like, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
that's human
Is
nature.
right? Is that not part of the human condition in general? Like, thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when I was reading the book, I was thinking of examples of how would an adult feel if they had as little control over their life as kids do.
Mhm.
And sometimes then kids get blamed for being irrational or temperamental or melting down and this and that. It's like some of them have absolutely no control, and they are human beings. So
Mhm.
they feel frustrated by that, and they don't necessarily know how to express it, or they are expressing it and it's not being heard. And so this control piece really kept coming back for me again and again throughout the reading.
Yeah, I will admit I didn't pick it up as such an overarching theme, but I definitely have that in my notes for a little later on. Right, there was the talk about the tantrums and the same kind of thing. Right, I was thinking um, the book is advocating for a different parenting style, and I was like, well, I hadn't read the book yet, but we definitely did that, right? Where I'm really big on, you know, talking through it instead of dictating, providing options. And I was, my kid didn't have too many tantrums, but I think that in large part that was because there were a lot more options. And like, do you want this or that? Would you prefer this or that? And giving even a little bit of control really can make a huge difference for someone who feels like they have no control, whether you're a kid or an adult, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it's a no-brainer. This is not complicated. It's just something that we don't often extend to kids.
Hmm. Yeah, that's the hard part to me is that they're just little human beings, right? They're little adults, and And then too, for them to move into that world, if we start giving it to them as they're younger and easing it into them and giving them the power to make decisions, they'll be better decision makers as adults too, and they'll weigh those options better, which is really, really an awesome thing as well.
Yeah.
The other thing that I noted, Amanda, is on page, oh my goodness. So the Roman numerals. Now here's an example of when you are forced to take something that you didn't want to take, and therefore you learn nothing and retain nothing. Because I took years of Latin in school, and these Roman numerals were kicking my behind when I was making my notes. And I took a lot of Latin, hated every single solitary minute of it. It was terrible at it.
I'm quite thankful to Michael Clay Thompson, because that's what we're using for ELA, and there's a lot of Roman numerals in the level that we're doing right now. So I was like, oh man, okay, I've got this.
I know it took me a second here, right? So, okay, introduction, page 29 in Roman numeral speak. There's this thought process. It says the great majority of boring, regimented schools were doing exactly what they had always done and what most people wanted them to do. Teach children about reality. Teach them that life is no picnic. Teach them to shut up and do what you're told. And then a little further down the page, it says they want their children, when their time comes, to be able and willing to hold down full-time, painful jobs of their own. The best way to get them ready to do this is to make school as much like a full-time, painful job as possible. So I was curious, we do homeschool quite differently. Your thoughts on that? And yeah, let's just start there. Your thoughts, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, what I think is most interesting is I flagged the second half of that passage in my notes to talk about today as well, for a slightly different reason. The story about the painful job is specifically from a small town farmer in Iowa. And that's where I grew up. We had a family farm. We had a century farm. We didn't live on it. We lived in the small town that was next to it. And I very much see this mentality, right? And it's still prevalent in a lot of people, right? The book goes on to say you can do other work, but if it's not painful work, it's not really considered work. It's a job, but it's not work. And how sad that it has to be that hard. I'm not a big proponent. I will say I'm not a big proponent of the whole theory of, do what you love. If you do what you love, you never work a day in your life. Like, okay, to me, if you have to earn a paycheck to doing what you love, it's pretty quickly going to become what I don't love, right? Like there's the way it's tied together. Like I'm not a huge believer in that whole school of thought. And I know it's a very popular one right now, especially these days. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be painful. It doesn't have to be dreadful and soul crushing, and schooling shouldn't have to be dreadful and soul crushing so that when you get out of school, your job is going to be painful and dreadful and soul crushing and you're ready for it, right?
Yeah. I mean, for the record, that was the academic homeschooler that said that, not the loosey-goosey girl. Okay. Right? Because I would have said that. But for you to say it, it's like, okay, you got to listen, right? Even Amanda's saying it, and they're very structured schoolers. Yeah, it doesn't have to be. I had a conversation that I will never forget. My oldest was still in public school. We were getting ready to pull him. He was 8 years old. And I was standing in a parking lot and having a conversation with a very good friend of mine who I worked with for many years. And I spent 10 years working in corporate America. And the number of times that I cried under my desk, cried in the bathroom, and tried to hatch an escape plan from this company that I was reliant upon for health insurance was no small thing, right? I mean, I've cried under my desk more times than I can tell you. And so I'm standing there having this conversation with this person that I worked with, and her rebuttal to homeschooling was, well, how will he get a job someday? And I thought, okay, we have cried together under my desk. So if you think that I'm going to put 18 years into this kid and my ultimate goal is for him to hate his job as much as I hate the existence that I am trapped in right now, that is not my goal for my child. Yes, I want him to be able to earn a paycheck and sustain himself and, this, that, and the other thing. But if that is all at the expense of any sense of happiness or purpose in his life, I've failed. I have tragically failed in this role. And I will just never really forget that, because I'm like, this is not my goal for my kids. Right. I want them to enjoy what they do. Yes, it's still work, right? But enjoy what they do, find purpose in what they do, find balance with their work and life and what they're doing. Not what we had.
Yeah.
So it was that section kind of jumped out at me, because that is one of the objections that you get about homeschooling is like, well, if they don't have to do things that they don't like, then they'll never know how to do things they don't like. Well, they're still going to have to do stuff they don't like. Does your kid ever do stuff he doesn't like, Amanda?
I mean, yeah, of course. I'm about to the point where he's going to have to clean his room because I have a rule. There has to be a path so I can get through it. And the path has disappeared, and it's going to take it'll be a whole day thing, right? But I mean, I'm trying to think. I suppose in our academics, I'm I would say we're a combination of really fortunate because he loves to learn, and I can't think of too many things that we have decided to learn that he didn't enjoy. But also, he has a lot of control in how he learns it. And so if it's something that he's not super excited about, we'll go find a way to learn it that he is more excited about. Um, but I mean, I suppose I'm trying to think. I'm sure in math occasionally, we use a math curriculum and we go through it, and um, there's no skipping around. You learn each thing, and I definitely want him to go straight through that math curriculum. So every once in a while there's a unit that he's like, oh, I hate that unit. I'm like, oh, it'll be awesome when you're finished with it then, right? Like, just it's one unit, and generally, like, do you want to change curriculum? And he's always like, no, I don't like, don't take it away from me. I just don't like this chapter. Like, well, sometimes that happens, so you're not always going to like every part of everything.
Trudge through it, my friend. Yeah. Well, and you were getting updates in our book club meetings about my oldest kid taking the driving test to get the driving permit. And I brought the book home from the DMV. I had gone to the DMV for another purpose, and while I was there, I grabbed the book and said, "Here, it's coming time." And he came down a couple of days later and said, "I don't know who wrote this book, but it is terrible. There's no dragons. The plot is awful." Right? He was like, "I'm not reading this." It was like, well, if you want to drive, you're going to have to read it, right? So it was, that book is torturous. It's awful, right? But he made it through. He did it. So yeah, they'll still end up doing things that they don't like. I mean, I have kids who willingly do chores. They don't love to do their chores. They're not like a Disney princess singing songs with forest animals while they're doing their chores, but they do them without complaint because it's kind of the culture of our household. But they don't love taking the trash out when it's leaking and it smells. They don't, I don't think anybody does love that. So they're still prepared to do things that aren't amazing and pleasant all the time. It's not like life is a picnic all the time. But to your point, it doesn't have to be painful as the other. There's probably some middle ground there.
Yeah, right? I mean, I think we all want the middle ground.
Yeah, painful is the opposite. So so I found that to be kind of one of my aha moments in the book. Do you want to hit another one of yours?
Well, I don't know exactly how much of an aha moment it was, but I found it really interesting. Also in the intro, let's see, on Roman numeral page 34, um, they make a distinction between doing, which is self-directed, purposeful, meaningful life and work, versus education, which is learning cut off from life and under pressure of threat or bribe. And I thought it was interesting. I do think that the language is maybe a little to say that education is learning cut off from life and that it's under pressure or threat. That's maybe going a little far, in my opinion, and from my life experience. But I did think that there was some value to trying to really frame life and education and learning in that way. You know, being empowered to want to learn or to want to do something is obviously going to be a more successful endeavor, right? It's just like what we were talking before, this idea that you tell someone what to do and they'll do it happily and retain it, like it's not reality. Like, I mean, maybe there are people out there that are like that, but it's no one in my house, right?
Yeah. Good luck with that plan. Yeah.
Right. And so it was interesting to, for me, I thought that little one, it's just a small paragraph, but it really kind of set the tone for the rest of the book, or at least the rest that I've read so far, in really reframing the, like, okay, we're talking about doing the self-directed, purposeful, meaningful version of learning and educating, not the top down, you will do this and you'll like it kind of learning.
Yeah, I agree with that. I highlighted a couple of things throughout the reading then that kind of um accentuated what you're talking about or built upon what you're talking about. On page 8, I highlighted the metaphors we use to describe children and how they learn are telling. We describe children's minds as being blank slates. Have you heard that? Blank slates, right?
Yeah.
So common, that need to be written upon. We talk about them being empty vessels to be filled or lamps that need to be lit. Sponge is another one. I'm surprised sponge isn't here. Maybe somebody thought it correlated too closely with the word moist. I don't know, but it's not here. Right? But it says all indicate an adult doing something to a child to make them learn. Upon hearing the motto of the Lamplighter School, which is a student is not a vessel to be filled, but a lamp to be lighted, John Holt replied, I've heard of that place, but they've got it all wrong. Their lamps are already lit. They just need to stop doing the types of things that blow them out. So we have learners. They're there. And I think some of the things that we talk about too, when we talk to people who are newer to homeschooling, especially if their kids have been in public school for longer, is their kids are not interested in learning, and their kids they don't have a ton of interests, really actionable interests that they want to sink their teeth into. And it's because their lamps have been doused, right? In a lot of ways over the time that they've been in school. So when we talked in our first episode about deschooling, for me, that's a huge part of it too, is kind of trying to figure out how to rekindle that spark, because learning should be amazing.
Yeah. I think it's so true. I was just talking with a homeschooling mom friend here not too long ago, and she was kind of saying like, oh, but you have it so easy because your kid just loves to learn and he's so happy and easygoing. And, like, that's not how it is at our house. Like my kiddos, they just don't want to learn. It's a real struggle to get them to, leave the video games or turn off the TV and want to learn something. And I was like, well, okay, I mean, there might be some truth in that. But have you tried something else? Like, I, and I was like, how about an easy thing? Like, start with some graphic novels that are actual, like, history. The Nathan Hale series is a great example of that. My kid loves them. He reads them over and over, but they're real history. Fun. It's presented in a really easy, palatable way. I'm like, maybe if you can't get him to do any of the history that you're trying, try something a little bit more enjoyable. And it was maybe not a week later that she sent me a message and was like, oh my God, he is loving those Nathan Hale books. He's devouring them. I've never seen him actually enjoy reading something that he learned from. And I was like, well, so often it's that thing of you got to find the right thing. It's not that they don't want to learn. It's not that there's nothing they'll be willing to learn or absorb. It's finding the right way to help them see, like, oh, actually, I can enjoy this. I would enjoy that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But aren't adults the exact same way? It's that
Absolutely.
conversation we were having earlier, right? Where somehow we expect kids to be this entirely different species who don't need the same the same motivation or the same information or the same options or the same environment to thrive that
Mhm.
adults need. Kids are just supposed to do what we ask them to. No questions. Just do the thing we've asked you to do. Right. And they're
Mhm.
just people. And they might, and then when you have multiple kids too, they might all need different things too, which is super fun. Right.
Yeah.
Super good times. But yeah, it's tremendous. I mean, having a kid who wants to learn, who wants to seek information, it's a beautiful thing, but it's definitely a two-way street, right? There's a lot of give and take there. There's a lot of culture building. There's a lot of foundation work that gets laid in there.
Mhm.
Going again to talking about deschooling yesterday, if you think you're going to pull your kids out of public school tomorrow and the next day they're going to be like, do you know we should build a giant model of the solar system? I think that would be fabulous. You're going to be in for a bit of a disappointment, right? It's probably not going to go very well. There's a lot of
No.
steps in between those two things.
Yeah, right. You might get them to watch Penguin Town on Netflix to learn about animals, but they're not going to be about, yeah, building
Just don't
a
tell them to get too
two-scale
attached to
model.
Mrs. Bougainvillea when they're watching. Don't get too attached to that one.
Yeah, but the parking lot gang, they stay bad the whole time, so it's okay to start hating them from the get-go.
It really was a good documentary, minus that one lapse in information. Good series. Um, yeah, it's incredible. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was I made some notes on page 11. That the concept is that all learning is interrelated. Yet in school, we divide science from literature, history from math, philosophy from physical education, and so on. But in life, there are no such divisions. And then it goes on to talk about the fact that we have this tremendous value on certain things in education. There's this theme of foreign language that's hammered on pretty hard in this first section of reading. They even bring in an economist to say what students are losing by being forced to take 2 years of a language in high school just to get into college. What could they be doing with those 2 years? If they were doing something that was niche, interest based, preparing them for college, study skills, there's a wide range of things that you could do with those 2 years since most of them don't graduate speaking that language anyway. Um, but yet, when a kid learns how to, make the most amazing pie in the world and wins the state fair, that's that was lovely, nice job. There's not a learning acknowledgement from so many people in some of those hands-on things because it's not one of those siloed subjects that everybody is looking at. So that was kind of a big one for me when we're talking about building this environment where we love learning, looking at where the learning is happening and being open to documentaries and graphic novels and things like that in the process.
Yeah, and I will admit that we're not so good about this. I know, a lot of homeschoolers really enjoy unit studies, and the the appeal of the unit study, right, is that you're kind of doing all of the things together around a central theme or a central idea, and you're getting each of your things. And it does not work for me. It doesn't work particularly well for my kiddo. And so we don't implement that much. But I do still think that one of the benefits, even as a pretty academic homeschooler, is that we're at home and it's just us, and we can have a lot of conversations about how these things apply, right? So yeah, we might be learning in a silo. We might have world history and then science and then math. But when we read something, it's like, oh, like that, did you realize how that worked with that other thing that we were just talking about? And you can't do that in a classroom, right? You can't do that in a classroom with 24 kids. And it's like one kid is like, hey, Miss Amanda, didn't that apply to that? Like it's not going to happen. It's like, there's not time. There's not an inclination most of the time. And so there's a lot of ways for that to apply. And it is one of those things that, you know, you get into college, it's all about interdisciplinary studies, and you get to work and it's all about, cross-functional teams. But yet somehow we think that shouldn't apply to kids when they're learning. Like, It's not rocket science. It shouldn't be that hard, but apparently it needed to be in black and white to make sure that we stopped and thought about it.
Mhm. And if to what your point was, right, you're learning the subjects in silos, but then you're going the extra step and connecting the dots so that your kiddo has all those reference points. If your child has been in school for a really long period of time, you're not looped in on what's been going on through the day. So you've not had that opportunity. So they've been
Mhm.
learning these kind of standalone facts and information, but that connectivity has been missing because you haven't had the opportunity to do it up until now. And
Mhm.
so one of the things that's really interesting is um, my one of my kids is an artist, and there's a ton of math and science involved in what she does, a ton. And she'll talk to other people sometimes who have had very traditional education. They could probably kick her behind on the SAT, right? In math, as far as that's concerned, because math as a subject is probably not going to be a strong point for her, but she can apply the math like nobody's
Mhm.
business. She can do the math. And then the funny thing is the people who are good at taking the test sometimes struggle to do the math in real life and to apply it in real world. So it's almost like they're two completely different skill sets.
Mm,
And
mhm.
you're able to bridge the two together, but not everybody's able to make that connection happen.
Well, yeah. I mean, the book even says that in that kind of same area on pages like 8 and 9, it talks about how the direct top down instruction really limits out of the box thinking, right? And it stops the creativity in younger children. Whereas if you aren't teaching them, this is what you have to do and this is how you have to do it, it's a lot easier for them to continue to come up with creative ideas and solutions. It's the same, the application versus the ability to memorize and regurgitate a bunch of formulas or whatever it is versus actually applying it.
Yeah.
And and even if you are a truly academic homeschooler, there are curriculums out there that help with that, right? Like for us, we do a math curriculum that is all about knowing how to take what you're learning and apply it to puzzles and complicated things because I don't need or necessarily even want him to be able to do perfect calculations in his head or on paper that he could do with a calculator. He's forever going to have a calculator in his pocket. I don't need him to do that for me, but I want him to know how to take that and apply it to real world problems and real life situations or puzzles, how to puzzle out something. We were just talking, he's working on algebraic equations and things, and really he was super frustrated. And he was, I don't understand why I have to write it all down. And I was like, for these, you just have to go step by step. And you do each step and you get through it and you work through it. And then you'll be able to figure them out better. And he was like, yeah, but I don't have to do all the steps. I can problem solve it without having to do it. And he was showing me he was getting the right answers with completely crazy problem solving I was like, okay, that's not it all what you're supposed to be doing. And I appreciate the fact that you were able to find the answers. Um, but I need you to understand that you're in fourth grade and you're learning how to do equations so that you can build on math. And if your goal continues to be to go to MIT, you have to know how to work through equations step by step. And this is just the foundation for that. So if that's not what you want to do, that's not your goal, then we can have a different talk and we can have a different way forward. But if that's your goal, you have to practice step by step, you know? And but it's that thing. It can absolutely crush the creativity. And I know in that moment, that conversation I was having was encouraging him not to creatively think of how to find the answer. And it's a struggle, to know for sure when is the right time to say, this is not time for creativity. This is time for actually doing it the way that we know works. Versus, what do you think? How do you think we should get there?
Right. Yeah, huge difference. I was laughing really hard because I have a 12-year-old who's a math lover, and he is wildly neurodivergent and originally started out in a math class that was online that was not geared towards neurodivergent kids. It was just kind of a general mainstream class. And the teacher would put something up and it was ridiculously simple for him. He'd have the answer in 2 seconds. He'd raise his hand. She'd call on him. He'd give the answer. Great job. Can you tell us how you got that? And that's when I laughed really hard to what you were saying, because he'd be like, when? You know, and it would be this whole story about how he got there. And the teacher would get really frustrated with him and be like, that's lovely, but that's not what we're doing here. And he's like, I got it right. And I got it first. So with all due respect, we're going to do this my way. And so it didn't go well. And the part of the problem was he lost his confidence in her because he was like, you are not getting my thinking.
Yeah.
And so now he's in a math class that's not specifically for neurodivergent kids, but it's taught by a neurodivergent teacher, and they're all there. Right. And so the whole class ended up being neurodivergent thinkers. And so if 6 kids do the same problem, they're all doing it 6 different ways. And so it's a very different world. Your kiddo would probably love it over there because he can creative think all he wants. But I completely understand your perspective too, and saying like, this is going to build and it's going to get harder. So even though today it seems really easy and these steps seem really stupid, at some point they might make a difference in your life.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, interestingly, I see that we, on our notes, because we have a Google Doc going with my notes on one side and Amanda's notes on the other side there, right? We both notated the same ending note, which I think is pretty funny. But you've got some others in the meantime. Do you have another highlight that you want to call out before we wrap up with our notes from page 49, Amanda?
You know, so there was, again, this is the academic homeschooler in me coming out. And that's part of the strength of this podcast, I think, is being able to see the 2 different sides. So in this first section, they talk about the fact that tech companies are not requiring degrees for tech jobs anymore. And it was a big thing in 2017, which was a little before the time that they were redoing this book and getting ready to publish it out and doing research. There were some great headlines. It made for great headlines and media coverage. But the reality is it's not really happening. Maybe we're moving towards it. The most recent statistics I could find was from 2021. But in 2021, 8 out of 10 tech job postings for Google required a bachelor's degree. More than 7 out of 10 for Apple required it. And 97% of Intel's jobs posting required it. So it's that thing. Yeah, okay, but go slow with this idea that you don't need a college degree to work at the top places. Please, it's not that simple. And the internet is full of Reddit boards and Quora posts of people saying, yeah, I work there and you can get the job, but it's really hard to get the promotion. It's really hard this. Or, yeah, you can apply for it and they'll consider you, but they're considering you against people who do have the same degree or do have the same certification that you have, but they also have a degree. And so they have a leg up on you because they have more. So it's just that thing of like, I understand they're making a point, but I don't necessarily agree with the point. And I just want to make sure people know that, right? You do not have to have a college degree. That does not have to be the route that you want to go. But please don't tell your kid, hey, you know what? You don't have to have a degree and you'll totally be able to get a job at Apple or, it's not that simple, right?
Yeah, you'll be making $250 a year at Apple when you're 19, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Not everyone is a Steve Jobs. Not everyone is yeah, sure. There are those people out there and they make great stories, but they are such a tiny fraction of the world. Set your expectations accordingly.
I mean, there's a reason that we could name them.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are a handful of examples. We might need to throw into a future book club selection a book that I read years ago, which the title is a bit misleading, in my opinion, based upon reading the book. But it might make your academic homeschooling head explode. And it might just be fun for me to sit and watch it and see how it goes. But the book is called Better Than College, and it's written 100% from an unschooling perspective. But the reason I say the title is a bit of a a misnomer, in my opinion. It's catchy, right? Like you said, it's a headline. It gets people's attention. It got my attention. I read the book. It's not an anti-college book. It very much says what you're saying, right? Not everyone needs to go to college, which is the message that we've been told for a really long time now. Not everyone. It's not the one and only path to success. There are jobs that you need it. There are jobs that you don't need it. There are ways to accomplish the same thing without it in some cases not so much. It's a huge proponent of gap year and really figuring out what you want to do before you go into college and things like that. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely, our society is still very much programmed around college degrees. It doesn't mean that it has to be drudgery and that you have to end up with $1 million in debt to do it and things like that. But it's not something where we are at a point where we can say it doesn't matter and everyone is, given puzzles and evaluated on merit and it's all going to be amazing. Unfortunately, in the HR hiring sorting process, it's still very much going in two different piles in some cases. So yeah, that makes complete sense.
For sure. And there was one other thing that I picked up on, and I was curious about your thoughts. So from pages 40 to 42, there's a whole section that talks about how parents will tell their kids they're going to do something and they end it with okay. And how misleading it is and how it gives kids the impression that they have a choice when they don't have a choice. And it makes a really big deal of it. And for me, I was like, well, I think that generally speaking, that okay is more of a, did you hear me? Or do you understand what I'm asking? Not a, do you want to do this? And so I guess I didn't really, I just didn't understand how much they were harping on it. Now, part of it probably is, I asked my kiddo, I said, like, hey, and I read him some of the passages and gave him some examples. And he was like, I don't think you've ever done that. So maybe we don't do it much. He was like, if you do it, I definitely don't read it as like, I have a choice. Like, it's just like a, yeah, okay. Like, so yeah, what was your take on that? Do you like, yeah, I just didn't get it.
I really sat back and thought about what my word choices when I read that section. I realized that even now in today's world with my kids being older, because I think a lot of the examples that they gave in that section of reading, a lot of it was geared towards younger kids. Like, are you ready to leave? Or it's going to be time to leave the park in a few minutes. Okay. Or I need you to put on your shoes. Okay. And I'm very far removed from those days. But I still say to my kids, so we live in a household where everybody is treated with respect and politeness and kindness, my kids included, right? They're not little minions or lesser thans that we boss around and tell what to do. So I'm going to ask them, can you please take out the trash? It's overflowing or it's full or whatever is the case. It's not really optional, and they know it's not optional. But at the same time, it also doesn't have to be done this second. They have the freedom and the option to say to me, oh, sure, I'm in the middle of something. Can I do it in 10 minutes? And they also then ask that question. Yeah, sure, no problem. I love it when they remember and I don't have to remind them, which sometimes I have to. We live in a pretty neurodivergent household, so that's A-okay. It's going to be the case. But I ask them, can you please empty the dishwasher? I feel like my kids make fun of me because when I talk to Alexa or when I I ask ChatGPT for something, I say please and thank you when I type stuff into ChatGPT, and my kids laugh at me. And I'm like, I feel rude. I know it's a robot, but I just feel rude not saying, can you please make this sound better? Or can you please give me a word that means this? So speak to my kids the same way, because I just feel like to say to them, I mean, what would the alternative be that I would say, take out the trash? If I'm not saying
command them, I suppose.
Ugh.
But maybe that is it. Maybe because we do, I may say, 5-minute warning. Okay. But it's okay for him to say, oh, I'm in the middle of this thing. Can I have 10? And so, maybe that's why it doesn't feel so weird in our house because it really is like an opening for buy-in instead of like a pretending like it's not a command when it is.
Yeah.
I
And I
don't know.
think
Yeah.
the other thing too is I think because at least I can speak for our household, there's a level playing field of respect. And so they understand if I'm asking them for help, it's not because I just don't feel like doing it. I don't have to say to them, I'm super busy. I don't have time. I need an extra set of hands or something like that. I never have to say that. They have an understanding and an awareness of the fact that I have a ton on my plate. And if I'm asking them for help, it's because I just genuinely need them to do something and help me out and take care of this. And so I think there's a bit of like a yin and yang that happens too, where everybody is kind of flowing. So my oldest kid wrapped up college finals about 2 weeks ago now, maybe. That last week, he was busy. He was taking 2 lab courses and his classes were daytime, but he would sometimes come home after class or just grab a bite down by the campus and then go back at night and have more lab hours so that he could finish up some stuff that he really needed to do before finals.
Hmm.
It was just kind of an open respect thing in the house. His job is trash. That's his permanent job. They chose permanent assignments. We used to have a rotation and they got together as a committee and decided that was not happening anymore. So his job is trash. If I had said to either one of my other 2 kids, which I'm sure I did at some point that week, hey, he's not home. Could you please take out the trash? It's overflowing. Or tomorrow's recycling day. Can you please get the can out to the curb because it needs to be done? And he's going to be home super late and he's going to be exhausted when he gets home. He's going to want to grab a shower, eat something and crash. Nobody's going to squawk. Nobody's going to complain because there's this kind of equilibrium that flows where when one person's overwhelmed, another person picks up. And so I think the okay thing maybe doesn't work so well if you haven't built that, but that takes years of respect and foundation laying to build. And so when you've already got that built, the question isn't a question, but it's also nobody would think to not do it. Right. Or they
Yeah.
might say, I'm heading into a thing with so-and-so on Zoom or blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of important. And I'd be like, oh, no problem. I totally respect that because I know that's important to you. I can ask somebody else to do it. Right. And so it just flows in that way. So for me, I did read it and think, I don't really think this terribly applies to us. I totally ask questions, but it doesn't seem to be backfiring. I mean, at the same time, that the piece that came right after the okay part was about tantrums and meltdowns. And I think if you don't have that part of it, then your okay part probably isn't that bad, right?
Yeah.
It's working for you if you don't have the reason why they're telling you not to say, okay.
Yeah. That's probably true.
So I don't know. That's how it works here. I can't say how it would work for everyone else. I mean, zip us a DM on social media or leave a comment on YouTube if you're watching and let us know your thoughts if the okay is working or not working. If you end up kind of in an uphill climb, then fighting kids to do things and all of that. But when we're talking about motivation for doing things and household culture, I noticed that we both made a note about page 49. About
Yes.
so for anybody who hasn't read the book, it's talking about this. They're comparing kids in the US or kids in traditional learning environments to kids in Bali. Have you been to Bali, Amanda? I feel like you probably have.
I haven't yet. It's on my list. We might go this fall or winter.
There you go. I'll put myself in your suitcase. We can podcast from there.
Yes.
So they talk about the fact that the Balinese do everything as well as they can. Their standard or their measurement for success is quite different than ours. And the author says very young children are like the Balinese. Just about everything they do as well as they can, except when tired or hungry. Oh, I get that. Or in the grip of passion, pain, or fear. They are moved to act almost entirely by curiosity, desire for mastery, and competence, and pride in work well done. But the schools and many adults outside of school hardly ever recognize or honor such motives, can hardly even imagine that they exist. In their place, they put greed and fear. Then it goes on to talk about reinforcements that we use for school children, petty rewards and penalties, gold stars, M&Ms, grades, Dean's List. I started out in our last episode talking about Dean's List. I was super excited when that envelope came for my kiddo. In short, if we give children enough time, as free as possible from destructive outside pressures, the chances are good that they will once again find within themselves their reason for doing worthwhile things. So we both noted 49. How does that impact you, Amanda?
You know, I'm torn on that one because I'm not big on reward charts and those kinds of things. We never did those. But I live in a house where gold stars or external validation is very important. It's not so much for me, but the other members of my family tend to need quite they thrive. I wouldn't say they need, but they thrive on external validation. And so I really wonder how much of it is nature versus nurture. Um, yeah, I'm not sold on the fact that it is all learned behavior and learned necessity.
Mm-hmm.
What was your takeaway on it?
So it's interesting. We are not a family that typically thrives on the physical gold stars, certificates, medals, things like that. We've also moved a lot, which I've said. So we have a thing where if you haven't touched it since the last move, it can't come on the next move because it's a great way to purge when you're moving.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think through having that family culture of not being weighed down by things, if my kids get a trophy or a certificate or something, they're like, what the heck am I supposed to do with this? Right? Like, what am I going to put it on a shelf? Like, to them, that seems strange. Just, it's not in their nature. But there's plenty of people who do that and it works for them. So we're not huge in that world. On the flip side, me, the super loosey-goosey one, have told my kids that they should keep a binder of accomplishments. Because when you go to fill out college scholarships and college applications, they're going to ask you about your volunteer work. They're going to ask you about awards that you won. They're going to ask you about this, that, the other thing, right? Times that you've been, written up in the newspaper, whatever it is. So I don't know that it's super us to do that, but I feel like as that tether to the real world, there is that need sometimes to have those sorts of things. So I have a kid who's got a binder this thick with ribbons and awards and all kinds of stuff that she's won for art. And sure enough, she's applied for internships and scholarships and all that. And they ask for all that stuff on every application. So I don't know that it's super duper us that we're necessarily thriving on it, but I think we're participating in some of it to some extent because there's a necessity component to it as the kids get older in some ways. So, and I have 3 kids who, if they were all to go to college at the exact same, or if they were all to go to college at the age that they're intended to, right, 18 to 22, they'd all be in college at the same time, which is expensive as hell. So, like, keep the binder, apply for scholarships, right? So we're kind of in it, even though it's not necessarily 100% us. But I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about.
Yeah. Well, our next section of book is we'll be reading chapters 4 and 5. Oh, 4, 5, and
4,
6,
5, and
actually.
6. Yep, 4,
4,
5,
5,
6.
and 6. I've dog-eared my pages. So we will be back in it there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment on the video, comment on social media, send us a message about anything. If you want us to dig into any of those components anymore, if you're thinking, I'm never going to have time to read this book, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about tech jobs and diplomas, let us know. We'll be more than happy to color in the lines a little bit more for you. So we hope you enjoyed our very first ever meeting of the Homeschool Moms Unfiltered Book Club. And we will be back with more book club content next week. Have an awesome day, everyone.
Yeah, have a good one.